Hi everyone. Bit behind today, sorry. We're playing catch up, which I wasn't planning on doing, but here we go. So welcome. It is Tuesday, obviously. You know that. You know the day of the week, and we are going to spend the next hour, as we always do, in that program, Capture One, editing your pictures. So not mine. So I come at this as a landscape and cityscape and commercial photographer. I've been using Capture One for decades. Sounds awful now, but a lot of you guys will send your images in and we can have a look at them because they've got often challenges on there in terms of how do you get the best out of your file that you've recorded with your camera in the same software that I use. There we go. So hopefully we get to learn a little bit together. So, as I say, the next hour we're going to edit some of your images, not all of them. I've got some requests this week, which is interesting. But we're going to edit as many as we can. They're going to cover quite a lot of different aspects. We've got some film scan stuff today. We've got some negative, as in film negative stuff today. We've got some reflection stuff. We've got some awful color stuff. We'll cover all of that today. But before we get started, so Capture One being that thing there, as I say, it's a piece of software that is written by the guys out in Copenhagen in Denmark. Those guys are able to effectively take what your camera sees and records on the sensor and on the memory card, improve it, hopefully, and give you the tools to be able to translate that into an image that represents and resembles what you remember at the time. Often, when you look at the raw file compared to either a JPEG in the camera or even what your phone takes or even what your eyes remember, sometimes it differs a little bit from the raw data that the camera recorded. The reason being the camera is not interpreting. It does to a little extent, but not massively. Your eyes do. They interpret through your brain. So your brain is telling you what you saw, not just the eyes. Your phone does, because your phone processes images when you record them. It has done for probably near on a decade now, if not more. So when you're seeing your picture on your phone and the sunset looks particularly vibrant and the sea looks particularly blue, it's because that's what the phone manufacturer knows you want to see. And the problem with raw files is they don't do any of that trickery. They are literally recording the pixels as displayed on that, so as exposed on that sensor based on the light that came through the lens. And we use raw processing software to fix that, to get it into our interpretation. And that's why everything I'm going to do today, everything I'm going to run through, every picture we're going to edit is my interpretation. It's not the same as me saying this is correct or this is the right answer. And it's something that those of you that have known me for a while, I get really angry when someone asks, what is the right way to do X? No such thing, because it depends on where your starting point is. It depends on what data you've got. It depends on what camera you were using. It depends on what you were trying to get to, where your end goal was. There is no black and white when it comes to photo editing software. The irony of that statement. But please don't fall into that trap of expecting a tick list or a to-do list or a recipe guide of this is how to do exactly that. You'll never get it on this channel, and anyone that does give you that is doing you a disservice. You are better off learning the tools, which is what we're going to do. So the version that we're running today is still, luckily, still 16.6.5. It hasn't changed for quite a while now, so we haven't had to do any updates. So the way that Capture One works is those updates will come if there's either bug fixes, minor features, or a new camera support that's needed. When it comes to a major update, so a major feature change, you will see the 0.6 bit. Let me put my Grover pointer up. Say hello to David Grover, those of you that don't know him. That's the guy that works for Capture One. So have a look at this one here. That middle one, when that one changes, if you have a perpetual license, you need to upgrade. The last number, the 0.5, when that goes to 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, no problem. If you own a perpetual license, you get access to that point or those minor point releases until it ticks over the middle number to the next major release or major version. If you're on a subscription, you should be on the latest version anyway. You don't have to be, but that's what you're paying for, so why wouldn't you be unless there was a reason? The reason could be your operating system doesn't support it, in which case upgrade your operating system. Maybe that your laptop doesn't support the operating system, in which case upgrade your laptop. Either way, you have the right to be on the very latest version. If you choose not to, that's fine, but bear in mind that bug releases are released in each of those updates, and you might be running with some problems that you didn't know about or have already been fixed, the most important part. Right, for those of you that don't know, uploading files. So to get files to us, you go there, paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com for the moment, still for the moment. Not going to go into that. That's a mess. So you go to that site. You can upload your raw file. You can upload an edited file out of Capture One. You can include any notes that you've got. You must write in the notes field your name, otherwise we don't know who it is, and it will not be used and published on this channel. For those of you that want to talk about stuff in between these weeks, go here to the old person place on Facebook. You know, it's where the old people hang out now. But you'll find a group on there, which is actually quite jovial, and we can talk about issues that came up either in this session or while you're shooting or during the week or whatever else. If you need help on particular topics, we have a series of masterclasses. You will find a link down there somewhere. All of that lot, and there's more to come. So those masterclasses are available for you. You can watch them infinitely once you've got them. There are also little bite-sized things, about sort of 10 minutes, well, 5 to 10 minutes each, or pro tips which cover most tools in detail. So I'm not going to go in this session into any individual tool in a huge amount of detail because it's more overview. If you want to do that, it's all freely available on there. Also, if you want to get out and about, remember, last chance, pretty much, that lot up there. So Teamwork are one of the medium format dealers in London. They're probably they're my favourite ones, so there we go. We're running a one-off 4-day little jaunt around the Jurassic Coast. It's all inclusive, it's all lovely, stay in converted barns, isn't that fun? But you need to book if you want to go on that. So there's, again, another link in the description. There's lots of links in the description, but have a look. You'll be able to get to it. And yeah, we can go out exploring. We can actually go and shoot things rather than edit them. But all that said, let's go into Capture One. So this is going to scare Edwin when he watches this back. So we saw a message on Facebook. It was in fact David Grover that alerted me to that message, saying, if you are going to edit my picture, can we maybe delay it? Now, we are not a on-demand personalised service here. Well, we need to get that clear. However, for the sake of Edwin's concern, we will not edit this one today, despite me saying that we would. We'll wait for him to be live online next week. And that actually brings me to the next thing, which is, please, while we're editing for the next hour, if you're online now, get tapping away, start asking questions, start digging, start saying that I've got something wrong. I'll have an argument. But you get the idea. If you're watching this in the future, obviously I can't respond to you. But if you are watching it live today with the usual suspects, I'm looking around, then please interject, and we'll get going. Right, let's have a look at the first image. Now, here's a fun one. This is Wimborne Town playing effectively my local football team. And genuine issue for me, because Simon mentioned that there's a huge issue with the brightness and luminance of Weymouth's team, or Weymouth's kit. I had to look up which side was Weymouth. So, not my thing. But turns out it's the green ones. There we go. Wish people would just say that. There's a problem with the green ones. So, what is the problem? Well, let's start again. So I've just cloned. You've just seen that. So I right-clicked on the image, go to clone variant, and I create a copy of the raw file with Simon's edits, and I'm going to flag it as red by pressing the minus key. And those edits allow me to see what Simon's done, but also anything I do to this version is not going to affect the original one, so we can always go back to Simon's originals. Now, there are 3 images in this. You've got this one, and this one. And Simon's issue is that these shirts have come out weird, janky, weird, funky, whatever you want to use. Now, interestingly, this shot doesn't have it too weird. Now, what I would say is, I mean, yeah, I know Simon now. I've researched it. It's the green kit, but what were they thinking? Dayglow green. What's that about? So, what I would say is not a helpful kit for photographers. Might mean that you stand out on the pitch. Might mean that you get found quicker in a blizzard in Weymouth. But it's not exactly helpful for photography, and actually it will cause lots of photographers problems thinking about it. So, kit designers, think about how you get your exposure and publicity. You need decent shots, right? So this is in the shade. So when we look at the kit in the shade, we can see that we've got this pretty green color. I'm looking up here at my color readouts, 148 red, 212 green, 91 blue. So in other words, most of the pixel is made up of green. The next most is red, which, green and red together in additive color make a yellowy color, which sort of makes sense here because it's a yellowy green. 91 blue, so, it's not completely yellow, not completely green. There's a little bit of blue in there, just keeping it not white, effectively. So if I were to go into my color editor here and pick on my green, we can see here it is it's actually smack bang. So this here is your saturation, from unsaturated in the middle through to fully saturated on the outside, and then our hue for yellow down to here, green down to here. And this smoothness determines the bleed outside of this triangle, but the dot is literally where I clicked on that shirt. So if I click in this shirt, I get a relatively consistent in the shade, mid green, sort of lime green. Okay, that makes sense. Not too saturated, not undersaturated, pretty good. Let's go to this version. Oops. And let's pick on this green here. Okay, it's a bit more yellow, okay, a bit more saturated, but it's still in that same sort of cone. Now, what about here? And things start to get ugly because they've started shifting around to actually oranges, right? So here we're actually in the desaturated place, now white. Now, we'll come on to that because it doesn't necessarily mean desaturated. It could mean something else. But in here, we're very much in yellowy orange. Here, yellowy orange, all of this stuff here, yellowy orange. So because it's reflecting that light so harshly, what's happened is the fluorescentness of it, so the yellow element of it, so which comes from the green and red channels together, have taken over. It stopped being lime green. It started becoming this sort of putrid yellow. And that's in the good scenario, because that would allow me, in theory, with the color editor, I could shift that back. The problem is that when I say here, this is unsaturated, because it's right near the middle, it's not just unsaturated, it's blown out. Now, this is the edited version. If I do before and after up here, I can see the pre-version after or before it was edited. And as I move my mouse around here, look at these numbers up top. 255, 255, 253, and then 255. In other words, this is completely blown out. So, number one, Simon, as we say often, be very careful with exposing to the right, because you've exposed to the extreme right, or your camera has, which it could have considered these as specular highlights and just gone for it and not realized the issue when it was metering. But the reality is you've actually recovered this pretty well, because the original in here is awful. It's blown. There's nothing in there. Now, if I were to create a new variant, so completely new, out of camera, this one here, and with my new variant, I literally go into just my exposure and pull this down. Oops, sorry, let's go to after. So we could say, right, well, we can recover it, right? Because we can get these highlights back. But look, even though it can be recovered a little bit, there's no more detail that's coming out of it. It doesn't really work. And to those, Lotfi and Prasad, that think that linear response fixes everything, unfortunately, fatal mistake. Linear response does help in extreme contrast situations. And the reason it helps is because when you pull in an image into Capture One, your raw histogram is automatically manipulated. So it puts in a little bit of a boost, unless you shot with a Fuji film simulation or profile, in which case Capture One reads that. If it doesn't, then it uses film standard, or calls it auto, but it's actually film standard, and it bumps the highlights up and it lowers the shadows down. It gives us a nice pleasing amount of contrast. If I were to undo that by switching this curve here from auto, or what is actually film standard, you can see it's the same, to linear response. So what linear response does is, if we look at this histogram, it changes that contrast profile. Quite extreme, actually, in this case. If you look at that histogram above, just moving around, so film standard, linear response, much darker. But what linear response cannot do, while it will smooth out that contrast curve and it'll flatten it effectively, look up here. That bit up there is not going to change. Why? Because it is so blown out that it doesn't make a difference whether it's linear response, film standard, expert scientific interpretation. There's just nothing in there. It's beyond 255. So in other words, there's no color data in here. There's no detail data in here. The pixels are blown. So what could we do? And this is not perfect. What could we do? Well, let's start with, let's try an AI brush, right? And let's just try grabbing this person here. Again, not into football, don't know who they are. Should do, really. Apparently they're down the road. Anyway, let's just get rid of that bit. So what have we got as a mask? Not a lot now, because I've just deleted it all. Let's get back to where we were. Okay, so in here, I don't want all of the faces. I just wanted that shirt, so that's a bit annoying. So let's undo that, and instead I'm going to create an AI mask. And instead of drawing it or clicking and hoping, we're going to draw specifically over the shirt. So you notice the difference in that mask. A lot of people now are using the AI masks and not realizing that you don't have to accept what you first clicked with it. You can actually specifically draw over what you want, and the mask will follow it. So in this case here, it's done a pretty good job. When I tell it, I just want that shirt. Option and M or Alt M to get your grayscale mask, so you can see that it's not picked up anything you didn't want. Okay. So with the shirt, doing this isn't going to do much, right? What I could do, in theory, is now in my advanced color editor, choose this stuff. Because remember, I've only selected the shirt. Make it really smooth so I don't notice any changes. Pull down the lightness. Maybe shift the hue to be a bit more green. Pull up the saturation. And see where we get to. Now, don't worry. Don't worry. It's all going to be revealed in a second. Let's pull that lightness down. Hue all the way across. Saturation up a little bit. Let's just see. Okay. Now, I've just made that entire shirt kind of putrid, right? Bad idea. This stuff here is better than it was. So it's gone from white to being a little more green. But this stuff here is now wrong. I accept that. So what can we do? Well, I only want to accept the really bright bits and the change happening to those, right? Well, that's then pretty easy. In fact, we can go even further. We can say pull our highlights down, pull our whites down. Maybe it's a bit too yellow, but we'll have a look. Maybe we go to there. Okay. So, yeah, to Paul's point, it's so reflected, this shirt, the arm goes green. Yeah, it's pretty punchy. Right. So what separates the bits that I want the change to happen to versus the bits I don't want to change that to happen to? It's the brightness, right? Or luminosity. So we can go to a luma range. And I can say I want all the bright stuff, please, but none of the darker stuff or less exposed stuff. In fact, I'm going to go all the way up there and have a really soft fall off. So you see this, it's sort of starting to blend a bit nicer. Hit apply. Now, this is too much, obviously. So look from there to there. But now we can start to tweak. So I could then pull back my highlight and my white, and I could go into my color editor now and slowly shift. We don't want the saturation that much. We don't want the lightness that much. Maybe shift that hue. No, that hue does need to go a bit more green. But we get to a place where, no, it's not perfect. It's never going to be, to be honest. But if I look at my mask with my luma range on there, I'm going to do something called rasterizing that mask. And I'm going to refine it. And refining, you see that little softening? So we go from there, quite hard, to there, a bit softer. Hit apply. And we now have a less horrible issue. It's not perfect, but it's less horrible. We've still got control over what color this stuff goes. We've still got the ability to change its saturation, so we can go more putrid, less putrid, whatever you want to call it. But if I just show you now quickly a before and after, I know that's not perfect, but from there to there, or more importantly, Simon's edit here to there, if I look at this shirt, it's not bad. For what it is, for that fluorescentness of the shirt, I would say this is a pretty good recovery of it on the right-hand side. I'm not happy with quite how yellow some of it's gone. It's not all down to the color editor. I could change the color balance. Remember, I'm only on this mask. So my color balance, I could actually shift to be more green. That's sort of helping, not too much. So let's go to maybe, I don't know, there. But I would say that's pretty good. Skin tone tool isn't necessarily going to work too well. Not sure who that is. I can't see on the picture. Because it's this and the shirt color are too far away from each other, and it's actually not got any color in what we're trying to change. It's blown. It's white. So I would say you could argue that this is as good as you're going to get with Capture One's tools. This problem, though, is from overexposure. So just to be clear, this is not an editing problem. This is a capture problem. You needed to capture it slightly under for the highlights, and that's something that maybe we just need to remember if you're shooting something that's fluorescent and bright and pretty horrific. Then maybe you need to factor in an underexposure, just a slight underexposure, to make sure that you don't end up in that same place again. If we don't like how much of an effect this has had as a layer, well, we can just pull back the opacity. So no impact through to full impact. You probably go somewhere in between, but that's the way I'd do it. So bit of color editor. Well, sorry, mask it first. Take out the stuff we do not want in the mask, so the stuff that's the right color. Use the color editor, use your HDR tools to pull the bits that are the wrong color back into the fold, and then do it. And that sort of works. Paul, to your question, if there's more than one nuclear shirted player in the shot, would you have to edit each individual player? Not necessarily. Yes, in theory, but not necessarily. So, for instance, here, because if you think about what we actually do as a process, what I do have to do is make sure that I'm masking each bit that I want to edit all as one layer. So I'm going to use my AI tool. So AI mask created. And I'm just going to select all of these fluorescent shirts. There we go. And take it with a pinch of salt. It's not perfect. Same with the socks. We do the same with the socks, but you get the idea. And effectively, we do the same thing. So we would choose. So number one, let's pull on a little bit of color in there. We would choose just get into here. The stuff that we don't want in there. We're going to smoothen it all the way out. We're going to shift its hue to be more green. We're going to pull up its saturation, pull down its lightness. You see the concept, same thing again. We're going to pull down the highlights, not too much. We're going to pull down the white. And then we're going to go to our mask with a luma range and say all the bright stuff. Let go of the shadows, tail off quite slowly. Hit apply, and then we're going to rasterize that mask. We're going to refine it, and then with what remains, we can obviously play with our tint. We could even, with what remains, if I just look at what the mask actually has, we could take our yellow and we could shift that to be more green, and we could pull down the lightness a little bit and stuff. You get the idea. But yeah, so in answer to your question, Paul, you don't have to do every single one individually, as long as you have a luma range and a refined mask on all the elements that you want to cover effectively. So there. So yeah, in answer to your question, Simon, do you have to make changes with another 100 shirts? You do, but you don't have to do them individually. You can do them in a picture in the same way. Also, remember, you can, fun fact, save these adjustments as a style or even a style brush. Ooh. Green nuclear shirts as a style brush. Let me reset these adjustments. Change this, because we can, to linear response, because it does help a little bit, but it's not going to fix the problem. Go into my style brushes, green nuclear shirts, I'm going to click once, and then I'm going to clear that mask, but all the styles have come across. Sorry, get rid of that comment off of here. Sorry if you couldn't see that. So I literally went into this image here with the one that I like, the style that works. Right click, save adjustments as a style brush. You could do it as a style, but I'm going to do it as a style brush. You save it, and then you go to the image that you now want to edit. You make the same base layer changes. So we do the linear response change, because otherwise we're not changing like for like. Just do that again so you see it all completely. Custom style brushes, this now exists in there. Click on it, click somewhere, doesn't matter where, but you can already see the impact that's having. Clear that mask, and then I can use the AI brush to grab the same shirts. Oh, isn't that quite sexy? The style brush. Look at that, boys and girls. Now, again, they're not going to be perfect. Also, we might want to refine that mask to not include the bits of the shirt that are okay. So Luma range, take all the bright stuff, pull this back, and you'll see it start to come back a little bit. You know, we can, let's go maybe to there. I don't know, actually, to there. Hit apply. I might want to refine that mask. Hit apply. We want to rasterize it first, sorry, before I do the refine. That was silly. But this sort of works, right? So we could then pull this back or up and down, whatever. But I now have a style brush that I can click on and just paint over people's shirts and make them green again. Make Weymouth green again. But if you look at the difference from here, which does feel wrong, to here, let me just pull the similar sort of crop so you can see it. I would say that's a better way of going about it. And especially in this one, you know, here's the original edit, here's the edit with linear response, and effectively now what is a style brush, but a color edit change that does sort of work. And yes, in the same way, so on Deep Sky Springs to Mind, it's the same as what we do with the Deep Sky brush. It's just this is now a custom brush that we save. So remember, if you've got something that you think actually that works as a recipe, that will work for future things, remember you can save it as a style, which applies to a layer, whole layer, or you can save it as a style brush, which means you can brush it in on a layer. You can still do that with a style, but by erasing. But effectively, you get to a place where you've got now a series of edits that are repeatable across every photo that you ever take. So if you did go and shoot this in the same setting, same light and whatever, bear that in mind, you will be able to reuse that brush. You can always change it as well to fix the problem. Or you need to underexpose a little bit, is the reality. Because in the shade, this looks fine. But I would argue now, if I look at here in the sun, here in the shade, these two kind of feel very similar. Whereas the original edit here, yeah, it is blown out. This doesn't fix, by the way, for anyone thinking it, this does not fix the fact that this is blown out. You still have the same issue with the patterning. It's just we've recovered it quite a lot. But it is still overexposed. It's just we've calmed it down. We've calmed down the brightness, but there's no more detail in there. It's not going to get anywhere from there. Tim, yes, we got it. And Roger, what's that? I need to work on the high-vis jacket in the background. This dude, this one, well, we can, right? So green nuclear shirts. Ooh, it's a bit too much though. So this is the thing. When I say about it's got to work across lots of different things, well, he's obviously not in the same lighting, the same, it's not the same level of problem. So what you can do though is obviously pull back the opacity a little bit. You know, you could get it okay. But there we go. So hopefully that fixes sort of the problem. But Simon, don't want to see this again. You need to change your exposure settings. And it is an annoying strip. I get that. That's a problem. Right. Georg. Reflection of the Castle. So this as an edit, actually, let me just go back to before through to after. Kind of like the edit. Let me just move this down here so we don't have so much white distracting. There. Okay. So if I go to my before, a little bit under. In fact, let's just create a new variant so we can see literally what it was. This is our histogram that came out of the camera with the profile applied. So the same thing. This has got auto. If I were to switch that to linear response, it will go a bit flatter, but with more detail on the highlights if we had any. Now, this is slightly underexposed. So what has Georg done? Well, quite a few things on some layers. So first off, in our image layer, there's not much changing going on in here except for a vignette that's been added. The vignette happens across all layers, so it's not like it's been done in the image itself, in the image layer itself, but wherever you do a vignette, it will apply to every single, well, it applies across all layers. It's layer independent, let's call it that. There's a base edit layer on here, which probably comes from what we quite normally do is either create a filled layer, do your edits on that, or do your edits on the image layer, and when you're finished, right click and say move image layer adjustments to a new layer, which means that with your base edits, you've now got the ability to adjust their opacity quite nicely together. So what's in base edits? Well, we've got a big levels adjustment. Not so much on curve, not much in color. That's pretty much it, actually, by the look of it. It's just the levels. So what is this doing? Well, it's basically taking what was this crushed up histogram down here. So in other words, in reverse to Simon's, excuse me, we've got no real massive highlights in here. If I were to turn on the exposure warning, you're going to see no red marks because there's nothing that's overexposed. The brightest thing in this image is probably the clouds. You can see this little orange bar. They only sit up here, even at their brightest. So all of our data is in here. And effectively, we know that if I went to my image layer, I can, if I turn on my exposure warning, I can push this image, not by too much actually, but up by 0.8 of a stop, so 2/3 of a stop, before I start seeing some warnings saying this is overexposed. When it says overexposed, think back to the last image, it means that one or more of these channels, red, green, and blue, have hit beyond 255. There's no more data in there to give. So we never want really, unless it's a source of light, anything to clip that. So let's go down to that 0.8 sort of level. So 3/4 of a stop almost. And still a little bit of warning there. So let's just go down to there. Okay. Now look at what's happened to our histogram. It's gone from there to there. It's shifted, and literally an exposure shift shifts the histogram. But that's not what Georg's done. So what Georg's done is stretch the histogram using levels, which is a slightly different thing. It's more aligned to brightness as a slider, but instead of literally picking up all values, which is what exposure does, picks up all values and shifts them up by the amount that you've indicated. So if it's up by 0.8 of a stop, it will have shifted all of the levels in your histogram up by 0.8 of a stop. Levels as a tool doesn't do that. Levels leaves the shadows where they were. But what we're saying is what was 202, I now need to make you 255. So in other words, what was not exactly very bright, it was a highlight-ish. Now I want you to be the brightest part of the image. Stretch it. And because this middle part hasn't moved, proportionately left and right of it basically stretched the whole lot. Now you can see though, if I look at, because this is all proportionate, the stretch between black, so 0, and the middle of 202 and black, in other words, stretch between 101 and black, doesn't feel like it's stretching as much, there's not so much of a lean as at the upper end. So what happens with levels, and it's very, you've got to look at it really carefully to notice it. It's very subtle. But if you're doing this, you're actually pulling the mid-tones and the brighter areas more. You're accelerating them. You're multiplying. You're dragging them further up than proportionally you're dragging the darker areas up. So the darker areas slowly taper off. There's no movement down here. There's no translation, no transition. But up here, there's a big swing of 50, so 20%. What that means is you've got a bit of a shift that's happening from here down in the shadows, but it generally is leaving it pretty much alone. But up here, we're dragging all these up to be really bright. So it doesn't do the same as exposure, and it gives you a slightly different effect. We did some of this last week, which you can see as well. The challenge I've got in here is we have got some clipping. Now, it's minor, don't get me wrong. There's nothing that I'd be worried about in here, but if I were to pull my exposure down, for example, I can see there's texture in these bricks. And we know in the original image there was nothing blown out. But as a result of this levels change, we've actually lost some detail in here. The red channel is clipped, the green channel is pretty close to clipping. So instead of that, I'm just going to use your exposure warning. If you're going to play with levels or exposure, turn on your exposure warning, please. If you don't, you've got no idea by eye, really, what those levels are. You'll get it, you'll get used to it, but it's so much easier with this. Set your levels warning in your preferences to be 255 and 0, please. None of this stuff helps. Oh, it might overexpose soon. That doesn't help me. There's still data at 250. There's still data at 251. Still data at 252. There's still data at 254. I only want to know when it's gone beyond 255. And with that, if I now pull my levels tool to go to there, happy with a couple of little blips, but I've got all my detail back and we're still okay. Now, what I do have in my toolbox, because this has now got a little bit darker, right? We'd agree with that. So if I clone this variant, it's going to go back to Georg's original edit. So 202. This feels like it's got darker, yeah? So this is Georg's, but we've got some overexposure issue. This is the new version with no overexposure issue, but it's definitely dropped. Whoops. From there to there, there to there. So what can we do? Well, this one. Because this, remember, is controlling that mid-tone point. How much of the shadows proportionately are going to be lifted versus how much of the highlights are going to be lifted. And as I start to change this, we lift the midtones. Now, the dark parts, the 0 and 0, aren't changing, but we're now translating those shadows more. We're lifting them more than we were before. Before, it was in the midpoint. Now, we're saying, actually, if you're down here a little bit, you're in the lower midtones, we want you to lift up a bit more as well. Now, what that's not doing is changing any exposure warning, because the highlights aren't changed. These are unchanged. It's not affecting this. This 219 doesn't change. All that's happening is we're shifting that mid-tone to be to the left or the right of the middle of the histogram. And if we look here, you've actually got more contrast in this. Whereas here, by now lifting that mid-tone, we've actually squashed some of it into the center. We can, of course, add a little bit of contrast, but be careful, because you can end up, remember, contrast makes your brights brighter, your darks darker. You can end up, with an exposure warning. So a little bit of a contrast boost, a couple points, 3, 4, or 5. Good. Maybe a little bit of clarity in there. And be careful, clarity is a contrast tool, so again, you can end up with a little bit. I'm okay with that, though. It's okay. So we go from there to there. It's lifted, but there's nothing that's particularly overexposed. If I wanted to now put in some extra shadow tone contrast, well, I can do that specifically in the curve. So this is, again, a representative of my histogram. I can lock these points, so I don't want these to change. I want 192 to be, or 193 to be 193. And I'm just putting these in as anchor points. You'll see why in a minute. I want 93 to be 93. I don't want them to change, in other words. But down here in the shadows, I want to pull that down a little bit. I could do that by shifting the levels down here. That would have a similar effect. But I like the amount of control I've got in the curve. It's a bit more subtle. And if I do without and with, you see it now pops a little bit more. It's a bit flat there. Now it pops. So minor change from there to there. But this is a cleaner image. It's not got any overexposure, and it's just got a nice feeling of contrast. Now, everything else, to be honest, Georg, I don't have an issue with any of the edit in there. You've done a decent job with it. Even the deep sky isn't actually overdone. I mean, it does look a little bit menacing, but I think that was what you were going for. I have one thing that I would say, though, which is nothing to do with the edit. Give yourself some headroom. I see this a lot. The temptation with the reflection is to put the midpoint of the reflection smack bang in the shot, and I've done it. We have prints that intentionally have this, but it tends not to be this sort of scenario. My worry with this is by shifting up and down, you can change the length effectively of that reflection in the water, changing your position that you shoot from. This feels like it needs more above the castle, and I looked at the crop. There's no more room up there. There's a tiny bit. You don't need necessarily, not it's your choice, it's an artistic choice, but in my opinion, you do not need the full reflection to give it the same sense. I would have preferred in this shot to see more space up here, because this here isn't adding anything. There's no detail in there, there's no interest in there, there's no foreground even in there. It's just a reflection of what my main subject is. So I want to lead up to my main subject. The way I make the main subject is by not making this symmetrical effectively, and this isn't going to work because we don't have enough headroom on the top. But I would have liked to have seen almost, not exactly, but almost sort of this sort of feel, just because this down here isn't adding a huge amount. So I would love to see a bit more sky up there. You could, of course, use a content-aware fill. Many programs are available for such purposes, but yeah, you could expand the sky. You could fill it with other stuff. You could clone it. You can heal it and whatever. But I see this quite a lot. This trap of trying to get the whole thing because you're so happy you've got the whole reflection. It's wonderful. You try and photograph it. If you are thinking that you might want to use the whole reflection, but you're not sure, literally just step back a little bit. Give yourself a bit more headroom up top. Just don't shoot it quite that tight, and then you can do it a bit easier. But that's the only thing. So just bear that in mind, Georg. If it were me shooting it, I'm just going to undo all of these steps that I did so we get back to the original crop. If it were me shooting it, I would have probably come up a little bit, or come out a little bit. So I've got some crop decisions I can make later without being stuck, because at the moment I've got nowhere to go up top. Where are we? Herbie, there's a minor bug where applying edits to a new adjustment layer will slightly boost the exposure of that layer, but only if the HDR sliders have been moved instead of adjustments. Didn't know that. Interesting. Haven't noticed it, but okay. So hopefully they get to fix that soon. Right. That does for Georgs. Moving on. Ken. Film buffs. I mean physical film buffs. Ken has sent in, rather kindly, a film scan. And we're just going to cover very briefly one of the challenges that you will have with Capture One when you're dealing with film. To call a spade, as it were. Capture One have another product for film scanning called Capture One Cultural Heritage, CH, which is a very expensive version of Capture One, to be fair. Now, that version is designed for museum scans, for archiving things, but also for film scans. And it's typically used by studios who have possibly larger budgets than people at home and so on. The cynic in me has always had a little bit of a concern that there's only really one. Well, there are other features in there that are quite useful, but the main one, the main feature, is that it allows you to use the tools correctly despite it being a negative. So I'll explain what that means, and you'll see hopefully in a minute why that's important. So here is the scan of a negative. It's a black and white negative. Let me just create another copy of it, because I don't want to edit the original one from Ken. So there's our negative. Great. I could, in theory then, so come in and crop. And some of you are not going to understand a lot of what I'm about to do until I start showing you. Sorry, a lot of what I've just said until I start showing you, but it will become very clear shortly how annoying this is. And it's annoying. So there's my crop. Lovely. I want to rotate it. So let's go for a rotate left. Keep the same crop. Okay, I didn't quite keep it clean out there. Could have filled that in, but okay. That'll do. Right, lovely picture. But it's negative because it's a negative, right? So what tool can I use in Capture One to flip that to not be a negative? Well, it's not going to be exposure. It's not going to be contrast. It's not going to be brightness, saturation. It's none of those. There's not a curve in here for negative. Hint, there might be one in cultural heritage. But in R1, no, there's no ability to change it from being a negative. So what the film scan guys know, it's a secret society, is that there is a different way that you can approach this, which is, bear in mind I just did levels, remember? We just talked about levels. Translates, right? So I can say what was 255 is 255, but now I could say what is 200 is now 255. And I could say what was 50, turn off the exposure warning, is now 0. So in other words, darks get darker, lights get lighter. What would happen though if I did that? So now what I'm saying is anything that was 255 is now 0. And anything that was 0 is now 255. I've flipped, I've inverted. So I've inverted all of the values in Capture One. Now, for those of you that are joining in, it's good this. We've got audience participation, curves, levels. Remember, curves and levels are very, very similar tools. They approach it in different ways, but they're effectively doing much the same thing. If you use a curve in a linear line, there's nothing you can't do in levels that you could do with curves. Where curves comes in is, by definition of the name, when you start using it in a curved line, but we'll come on to that in a second. So I've now flipped everything that was bright white to be dark, everything that was dark to be bright white. Great, I've flipped it, that's good. It's overexposed. Well, let's use my exposure. Huh? Hold on, I'm pulling my exposure down, but it's getting brighter. Why is that? Remember, I've translated everything that goes from 255 down to 0. I've reversed the values. So all of my tools are now opposite, and it's going to get really complicated in a minute. Do you remember those bikes on a beach with the reverse handles? Everyone always used to fall off. We've just turned Capture One into that, annoyingly, because if you have cultural heritage, you don't have to. Anyway, so if I want to make this darker with my flipped levels, I need to change my exposure to be brighter. In other words, I need to make the source data before that flip darker. Sorry, brighter. So it becomes darker. There you go. Now, there is another way of doing this. So I've done that with levels. For those of you that were screaming out the opposite, let's just pick this up correctly. Oh, come on. Reset the tool. Easier. So instead of using levels, I can use a curve. So I can say my Luma curve, for example, it's black and white image. Oh, sorry. It's going to flip the other way. So we go, the darks have now become completely bright. The brights have become completely dark. It's the same. You can see it's the same thing. But what we can do with levels is, because I now know the reason that I needed to shift that exposure is because, just like before, all of the data is down here. In my output with the flip, you notice all my data is up here. It's reversed. Everything is reversed. Keep that in your heads. So I could then move this curve linear to come down to here, which sort of helps with it. Not completely, but it does sort of help with it. And I could shift that to there. Okay. Now, personally, I don't think that's quite as nice. I clone this, and I'm going to reverse my levels and go to my exposure. I think the exposure tool is a more forgiving tool when you're doing this than a levels change, sorry, which is up here. So this is with that levels adjustment here. And we can play with it, but you get very contrasty. And then what you've got to start doing is sort of reversing the contrast. So you can do it a little bit with levels, but what you'll end up doing is pulling contrast down. We might want to then pull up some exposure. You get into a bit of a mess, basically. And the one that Ken sent in, this is the edit. Nothing. I like the edit. Don't worry. There's nothing wrong with it. But you'll see here, the exposure, it feels less crunchy. You see, this feels very binary. It's got very, very contrasty. And I think some of it is because it's been done in levels. You've softened it, Ken, with a slight slope. Oh, sorry, in curve. But I think if you'd done it in levels and then use some of the original tools, the exposure tool, whatever, because they're shifting all values, it feels a little bit more forgiving. Let's call it that. Now, what this has done is it's made it a little bit sepia, which in part because I've done it in levels, which are RGB rather than a Luma curve, I can change this to be enable black and white, and we go back to pure black and white. So no issue there. Flat transition, no problem. But here's where it gets really, really weird and creepy. So think about this. So not only have my tools reversed in what they do in terms of the slider, but also what the tool is the opposite. Let me explain. If I want to adjust my highlights to be darker, okay, highlights darker. Well, that's not doing it. That's making highlights lighter. Only it's not making highlights lighter. Highlights darker than the opposite way. It's not making my highlights lighter. What's going on? My highlight slider, because everything is flipped, has become a shadow slider. And the shadow slider, if I make things brighter, they become darker. If they become darker, they become lighter. So my shadow slider is now for highlights. And if I want the highlights to be darker, I need to make my shadows brighter. The black slider. If I want my whites to be darker, I need to make the black slider lighter. If I want my shadows to be deeper and darker, I need to move my highlight slider to be brighter. This is why it gets annoying. So, in terms of this edit that Ken's already done, you can see that there is a difference between these two edits. I think the way of doing it with levels and some exposure is probably a little bit more forgiving. You see there, it's less. If I look at these two side by side, let's just go into the tree. This just feels a bit more organic, maybe, than the one on the left. The one on the left feels a bit too crunchy. But that's personal taste. Like I said at the very beginning, it's purely down to personal taste. We can up a bit of contrast. Remember, contrast doesn't just... remember, the contrast is also flipped, but not in the way that you think, because contrast is still... Oh, actually, no, it is. So what contrast is doing is effectively... dark. When we go this way, we darken our new highlights, and we lighten our... darken our new shadows. I give up. Anyway, a lot of this becomes really about using the dial and working it out. It would be a lot kinder if they would just put a ICC curve in there for negatives, but I understand the business decision. It's a business choice, and it's a specialist product. I get that. In terms of fixing some of this stuff, yeah, let's just go into our healing brush. I'm manually choosing a source location. All of these sort of things, just bear in mind. So again, your healing brush, you've got to play then, unfortunately, with the reversing what it's done in there. So what we can do instead, remember I said before, right click, move adjustments to a new layer. And I may have just screwed that up. Let's not do that. We don't like doing that. I now need to get my head around what we've just done with our healing layer, because the healing layer should have had the adjustments applied to it. So I'm not exactly sure why it's done that. Let me just double check. This could be an interesting one. Our cloning layer works perfectly fine, but our healing layer is doing something a little bit weird, and I need to get my head around why. That's one for me later, but anyway. Same issue up here, so let's just pick on this little bit up here. Might want to take a slightly different chunk of cloud. I might want to then overall with the image layer add a little bit of vignette. Just remember again, so your vignette works the opposite way. Remember, so just for a bit of nostalgia, whatever. And then ultimately we can still play with our curve. Remember, so we can still create some contrast in there by putting in now a little bit of an S and all that sort of stuff. So you can still do this stuff, but you get the idea. It is painful using the standard tools in reverse. It is genuinely like getting on one of those bikes and trying to steer it with the handlebars the wrong way around. But what you are effectively doing is taking a literal negative scan, in this case that was overexposed, hence it's so dark, and you're able to edit it in Capture One into a perfectly fine image. And this image here, Ken, the edit is nice. You know, if that feels like the right film for that scan, then this is lovely. Keep with it. It's just this to me feels a bit more organic as an edit because it's softer. It doesn't have quite the same crushed sort of shadow stuff to it. But yeah, it's annoying. I'm not going to lie. This is annoying. David, so would it be better to stick in Photoshop? In some ways, so yeah, using a pixel editor will make some of this easier once you just invert it, because then you can use the tools as if they were normally inverted. The problem is that before you do that, you almost want to get as much out of the dynamic range that the camera recorded as possible before you hand it across as a flat file, as a TIFF or whatever. So I would still try and do any levels work and any curve work in Capture One. I'd also play, if it's color, I'd also play with your white balance in Capture One. Remember, they reverse. And play with any recovery, so HDR stuff, use that as well. And then if you find it impossible in your head, playing with the other tools because they're all flipped around, then maybe move into a pixel editor instead. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think that's where you were coming from, Arthur, as well, which is, yeah, you can do your inverting thing, a standard thing within Capture One, get it out to a pixel editor, and then all of a sudden your tools feel more natural. I don't personally agree with the fact that this is made difficult, because for lots of reasons, but that one's a Capture One decision. It is a separate product, and the product's designed for different user group. It's designed for museums and so on. We've got a few minutes left. Bob, you sent this in with a really nice note saying that Bob learns stuff from every single one of these sessions, and he's got a folder of images of things that he's learned. And I'm not going to touch this, to be honest, Bob, because it's actually a good edit. But what Bob was referring to in here is trying to get... So if you guys remember before, and I mean this literally before, way before in old school, we had this magical, oops, sorry, didn't mean to click that, this magical little slider down here called dehaze, which some people like, some people don't. People forgot that we could do all this anyway, so you don't necessarily need a dehaze tool to do this stuff. And dehaze does have a challenge, which is it makes everything dimmer. The reason is it's getting rid of some of the lightness out of the image, because it's getting rid of that layer of whatever shadow tone, effectively, we want to correct with. Whereas this version's a lot nicer, right? So there's my original. That's with dehaze pretty much automatic. And this is Bob's edit. So what Bob's done is on a global layer, so everywhere, pulled down clarity, which is an unusual thing for most of us, right? We normally put it the other way, but pulled down clarity, pulled down some structure, used actually negative dehaze, and then picked on your RGB curve. So the RGB curve lifts effectively saturation of channels as well as their lightness. So a Luma curve won't have the same effect as an RGB curve in this case. So if you want to increase saturation, you want to make it look a little bit funkier, this RGB curve's the way to do it. And that curve, if I just undo there and redo, by lifting the upper ends of the histogram. So remember, your histogram is based on, this is the data that was recorded from here to here, not all the way along. So having a curve do stuff up here is pointless. It's not editing any data. You need to shift that line and say, this is my start point. This is what was 148, now needs to be 253. That number's there. So I would be in a place of moving that curve, the start point of the curve, which is what Bob's done, lifting up the highlights, pulling the shadows back to where they were, in fact, even lower down there. You don't really need to change your levels. A little bit of brightness on there, but look at the difference that's made in that to that. And I would argue it's better than the dehaze equivalent. There's a graduated mask on here, just in that left-hand corner, and that just keeps the focus on the bird rather than it getting brighter as it goes off to the left. I'd say you could almost pull that back a little. You've already pulled it back 35. I'd pull it back a little bit more as well, Bob, to be honest. But this is a great example of one very simple change. That RGB curve has lifted that image by a huge amount, and you didn't need to use a dehaze tool, which is doing some stuff behind the scenes that not everyone understands. We didn't need to worry about playing with levels and all this other stuff like that, because it's just done it in one little go, one little curve. Nicely done. Well done. Roger, I'd be tempted to keep the clarity in the heron. Yeah, you could always, of course you can. Use your AI brush on your heron itself. So we want to get rid of clarity out of the background because it's distracting. But on the heron itself, of course, you could pull that up, pull up some structure. Yeah, but just don't push it too far. We don't want it too much of a difference. So there we go for this week. It's exciting, isn't it? So that is Bob's heron. Not much to say with that. Really good job. You don't need the auto tools. Do it better with the curve. Ken's image or scan, again, all about curves, all about levels. But yes, it is possible to edit negatives in Capture One. You've now seen the quirks. You've now seen some of the pain. But also need to think about what your workflow is going to be. Keep it in Capture One or move it to a pixel editor. Georg, nice image. Just be careful with those clipping highlights and give yourself a bit more room in the top. And Simon, get them to change their kit, mate. That's just annoying as a photographer. I would have a word, but I don't even know where to go and see them. Even though apparently they're down the road. Right, and then next week, when Edwin's back, at his request, we'll start with Edwin's Kingfisher. Between now and then, as I said earlier, you've got access to all of that stuff, and you've got access to pro tips. You can upload your files in that WeTransfer location, and you can chat away on Facebook. But between now and next week, look after yourselves. Go out and take pictures. That's what you're there for. We'll see you then. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.